So the one thing that we clearly understood when we looked at our yield was that if we did not have a student visit campus, our yield was like 1 or 2%. If a student visited once, that went up to maybe 10%. And if a student visited more than once, then, it got into the 20, 30, 40, 50%. So our focus was on getting students to campus. And in the beginning, we were able to do that because we had a partnership with AirTran, which was doesn't exist anymore, but it was a sort of a low-cost carrier, and AirTran offered us free tickets for a student and a parent to come to Oglethorpe from anywhere in the country. And so we flew them in from Florida and Tennessee, and we flew kids in from Alaska. We didn't get many of them, but we got some. So our sort of entire focus in the admissions office was to get students to campus. And when this airline deal went away, we decided that it was still worth the investment. So I don't know what they're doing now, but up until I left, we had these scholarship weekends, 2 scholarship weekends in January, February. And we actually we ended up having to go to 3 scholarship weekends because they were so popular. And we would bring students in on a Friday, and they would go through a sort of competition for a full tuition scholarship, and we would award maybe 10 full tuition scholarships. But we had 500 or 600 students spend the weekend with us on campus with their parent. And they were probably the most lively weekends we ever had on campus because we were a small campus. So it sort of felt like we were, like a little bit of like a football school. It was like,
I remember the JEO weekends.
Yeah, yeah. Even though we didn't, none of it was based around the sport. So yeah, heavy investment in getting students to campus and having them and their parents have a really rich experience. And we would end up yielding about half our freshman class would come from those weekends. And when I got to Oglethorpe, we had 168 freshmen. And when I left, we had 400 and something, 410, 420. It also, we had the advantage of being in Atlanta. And so we just sold the heck out of Atlanta as a city to learn in, as a city to be in. It's an advantage most small colleges, do not have. Having a location that's, if not unique, is special. And again, I had sort of thought that we could not be successful unless we were somehow able to shift the curriculum, and the curriculum shifted very little, and we still managed to bring students in, selling them on, the experience of being an Oglethorpe student. Small classes, get to know your faculty, just as a good place to be in Atlanta. So what I would always tell the board is that execution trumps strategy every day. You could have, the best strategic plan and the best thought out plan. And if you don't execute the heck out of the plan, it's not worth anything. And so we executed really well with a top-notch head of admissions. I spent a huge amount of my time focused there. When those families were on campus, I was everywhere 24/7, and they felt like they got to know me, and that they could trust me with their son or daughter. So there wasn't anything magical about it. We benefited off the location, and then we benefited by making that investment and getting students there and having that be a really positive experience. And then we ran a really high discount rate. And so what we bet on was volume.
Mhm.
We could continue to increase the size of the first year class and do reasonably well with retention, that net revenue would grow every year. And it did. And what I said to my successor was that, our model was based on running a low cost institution and growing enrollment year over year with a heavy discount rate. And he didn't like that model. So he tried to lower the discount rate, and this year they're gonna fall well over 100 students short of where they need to be. So, but it's that
Between.
just came across my mind is that I always had this sort of idea at Oglethorpe, because we had very little brand. We didn't have a bad brand, but we just had very little brand, was to try to figure out ways to brand up. So in Atlanta, we had, as an example, the students who came to scholarship weekend would get a letter from either the Coca-Cola Company, Porsche North America, or Chick-fil-A, 3 big Atlanta, sort of introducing them to Oglethorpe and inviting them and talking about the interns that worked at those places. And so,
That's a really interesting idea.
Idea of branding up, where they like, well, we don't know the name of the institution. We don't have a bad connotation, but we don't really know it. But if the governor of New York, or whatever, any ways that you could sort of think of having people associated with a brand that people that know and have respect for, associate with you, then you're somehow, you're sort of under riding that wave. And so I don't, if there are companies up that way, or even if you have alums that work for, a big company, or EYP, or I'm sure you've got alums out there to sort of, instead of just recruiting them to come to an event, but actually writing something on their stationery that students would get a letter from the CEO of Chick-fil-A. It's like, oh my God, what could be better? They're going to come to college and get a free chicken sandwich.
Larry, I have one more very controversial question to ask you, and I could be blowing myself up, I'm not sure. But bottom line, as a board, it is our responsibility to ensure the future of the college. So other than micromanaging, what is the best thing that the Russell Sage board can do to support the college and the president to move forward? And any ideas based on your experience of being both a board member and a president?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've written some about this, that I actually think the role of a trustee today is different than it was 10 or 20 years ago, when you would ask a board member, like, what's your primary responsibility? And they'd say, well, hire and fire presidents. That's what we do. And then we turn the place over to the president. And I don't think that works anymore. I've seen too many boards let the institution head off in unsustainable directions. So I never would suggest that you ought to be micromanaging anything, but you need to be asking the hard questions. And I would say generally sort of setting parameters around budget deficits, around borrowing, and around things like faculty, student, staff, student ratios. You ought to have these sort of guidelines that can be broken. So if you sort of say our debt ratio ought to be, X number or in some range, and the president's able to convince you that there's an investment that's worth moving outside that range, but that would have to be a very specific discussion and vote. Otherwise, you set the sort of the guardrails for an institution.